Hello and welcome back. So now we're going to get into sort of the meat and potatoes of programming, and that begins with the chapter 1 test inside of our spec runner. So the way it's going to work is that each of these different descriptions here is going to be located inside of a different file, and we're going to learn how to use the console in order to do debugging. So the first thing to show is what a test looks like. Now this is a particular style of testing called behavior-driven design, where you write out what you expect the behavior to be, and then if it passes, you get this green right here, and if it fails, you're going to get a bright red. So if I go into the first list of tests, which is under Chapter 1 Spec, Objects and Methods, if I go right here and I say expect obj to be undefined. So right here I define this object, and here I'm saying I expect it not to be defined, which should be false. And we see as soon as I reload, it says 1 failure. The red X here shows which one failed. And if I follow out the entire description, it says can create a basic object. And right here, that is the expectation. It can create a basic object. If I remove this, immediately we see that it passes. So the first thing that we're going to need to learn before we get too much further along is console.log. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to see the object inside of the console bar down here, which once again, right click and inspect, or you can fly out Chrome right here, go to more tools and go to developer tools. So if I reload it now, when you get to that object, it printed it out to the screen. And if I click on this, it'll show you exactly where that came in. The next useful feature is console.dir. And what this does, it tells you what methods and properties are available on whatever it is you're logging out. So here they look almost identical, but there are cases where you'll see a difference between the two things. And then finally, the most useful one of all, and the thing that really helps out developers, is the debugger. So now whenever I reload my page, it stops and halts execution, so that way each time I hover over a different variable name, it shows me what the value of that variable is. Over here, this will step over a function, so right there, there's a function definition, and when I step over it, it's going to go to the next piece. Right now it knows that this is an object and it's an anonymous function. And if I do this one right here, this is stepping over. So there it performs the function, but it doesn't go into the details of it. This one right here will allow me to step into it. So now it shows me, okay, for the first name you put in Bill, but the last is going to be undefined. And this little structure right here just allows it to give it a default name. So now we know the value of name 1 is hello Ryan Michael, and the next one is hello Bill Michael. So this just shows you how that works. And by stepping through and debugging your code like that, you can learn exactly what's going on. So being able to step into and out of functions is a key feature. So the first thing we're going to learn how to do is, once we get past our debugging here, is we're going to learn how to create a basic object. And there's nothing much to it. All an object is a set of key value pairs. So whenever I go here to my console and I create the object, right now it's just an empty object, so there are no key value pairs. But if I say name and I give it a name, now when I type in the key, which is object and then .name right here, this name is the key. I'm going to get the value stored in there, which is John or Jane or whatever it is you want to put there. Whenever you access a value like that, when you get a primitive back, this is usually called a property. So this J is a property, or the name rather, is a property of this particular object. If I want to create a function off it, this is called a method. So right there, I created a method attached to the object, and then now I'm saying say hello. This is important because everything you do in JavaScript, even this very bland example of hello world, you're creating an object and using a method. In reality, if you don't specify in JavaScript what function you're calling, and if it doesn't know what it is, it's going to assume it's on the window. So what I actually just did here is I said, window.alert hello world. Likewise, if I just say ZDR equals that, well, what actually just happened there is ZDR got created on the window object. So now I can see that right there. So that's the first thing, is that to create an object, you just use the var keyword, and what that does is JavaScript uses what's known as lexically scoped. Now, you don't need to worry about this too much, but that means that every single time you create a function, any of the variables you create in there are local to that particular function. So each time I go up, if I created a function right here, or excuse me, a variable right here for x, this x would be visible to everything beneath it, but nothing outside of it. So it would not create x on the window object. And the reason why that's important is that if we log out the window object, you see how many methods and how many objects are attached to the window. It is incredibly bloated. So because of that, you generally want to stay away from putting variables onto the window object, because there's a high risk of collusion, which is to say someone else may have already created a name property and yours is going to overwrite theirs, and then your program is going to have bugs and you'll have to go debugging it and stepping through it. So the next thing we can do is we can create a basic object and assign a property to it. So right here, if you run that right inside of your console, which type clear, should get rid of it. If that doesn't, then click this button right here and that'll clear out the console. So we can't use the error there. It's a nice one to demonstrate, is that it's saying that expect couldn't be used at this particular time. So right here is what I did. I created an object and then I assigned it the property name, and that name is assigned Ryan. And in my definition here, what this says, it says expect the object.name is going to be equal to Ryan. Next up, to demonstrate something that we've just seen already, is we can create a basic object and assign a method onto it, and that's the sayName function. So when we run this, each time we do it, if you supply a value in, that value is going to be used. Otherwise, the default of Ryan will be used for the first name, and the default of Michael will be used for the last name. Then it's going to return hello with your first name and your last name. Now what you're seeing right here is called string concatenation, and we're going to talk about strings a little bit later. For right now, a lot of the things when it comes to introductory programming, you're kind of just going to have to take my word for it, and then as you start playing around with programming more and more, you'll see how this all works out. The next thing we're going to look at is that thus far we've been accessing things with what's known as dot notation, but technically JavaScript has two ways to access things. The dot notation is by far the most common, but sometimes you need to access things in a dynamic method, which means someone might give you something and you need to be able to dynamically run it. So here if I put in some prop, that's going to evaluate to name, and so it's going to say, okay, you're actually looking for object.name, so it's going to give me Ryan right here. And we can see that right here. We create an object, we assign the first name to it and a greeting on it, and then we access it. And we expect both to be equal to Brad. If I was to access the function this way, it would be object greeting, and then I can invoke it like that. I'll clear this out, reload the page, and you can see that the greeting of hi Brad got returned here. So that's how you can dynamically invoke a function. And one of the main annoyances for people who are just learning JavaScript is that there are numerous ways to do the exact same thing. So when you create an object like this, or create anything using this direct equal sign, that's what's usually known as the literal syntax. So I say var object and I set it equal to, and this right here, this curly brace, this is called braces in programming. That right here, this creates a new object inside of JavaScript and in most other languages. Then I set first name and last name, and then I expect that whenever I return it, it's going to be equal to hello Bill Doe, which that test passed. If you're wondering about this, that is another source of great dispute in the JavaScript world, but it's what's known as a pseudo variable, and all it does, it says for this particular object, bind the names onto it. So Don't worry about it too much, but it's definitely a big part of JavaScript and some of the frustrations that come with it. Now, the other way to create things is what's called the constructor syntax. Constructor syntax involves the new keyword. So here, John Doe is a new person creator, and we expect that whenever we call it the greeting, we get hello John Doe, and we expect that whenever we set the first name equal to Bill and we call it the greeting again, we're going to get hello Bill Doe. And that uses the same syntax we've seen above, right here. So these are just slightly more elaborate examples. And finally, the last way you can do this, if you want to go for literal in the constructor, you also have a static method, which is object.create. Whenever we say static, that just means you can call something without using the new keyword. So here, John Doe gets created, and it works exactly the same way as above. The overly verbose object.create method gives you precise control, so you can set things to be writable, true or false. If you set it equal to false, then the value of John will never change, which there's some instance where you want that to happen, but usually not. So this gives you fine-grained control, but I tend to find that in practice, developers very rarely use this because it's just so overly verbose. You have to write a lot of stuff before you can get into the programming. You can see how much more terse and nice this is than sort of how bloated and drawn out that is. But they're all valid ways of creating new objects inside of JavaScript. So in this lesson, we've taken a brief look at objects and a brief look at the console and the debugger.